everybody reads the book and shares their information that they've gotten from it and tells people about it. And I think Julian may have a chance if that happens. The speakers tonight are in Mate, Nathan Fuller, Amy Goodman, and Barry Pollack. I want to thank Jake and Karen Minucci for letting us use this house. This house is a really important place because this house is where Michael worked, and he worked downstairs in this house for Julian Assange. And every day he was on his cryptophone. I inherited the cryptophone. Getting away from my joy at this evening, I want to tell you that we're in a very, very difficult period. These are very, very dangerous times. We see what's happening to the world. The right wing is taking over, and we're not in any control, and everything is getting narrower and narrower. And it's also a time when we're being distracted from what is really happening and not paying attention to the important things. What is happening is that the powers that be are upping the ante. Charging a journalist with espionage is eating the First Amendment. It's outrageous. The First Amendment doesn't allow for an espionage charge. The entire indictment violates the First Amendment. And anybody who's a journalist who is sensitive to this knows that this is a total threat to news gathering, to giving out information, and to educating people about what's happening. It's a total threat. And on the other side of it, Julian is being housed in a prison as if he's a terrorist. So this is really upping the ante. We're getting rid of the First Amendment, and we're holding Julian as if he's a terrorist. He's a journalist. He should be out on bail. Why is he on 24-hour segregation, isolated in a maximum security prison? This is where we are. This is a terrible situation. Secrecy is power, and Julian's ability to inform people has really saved many people. And if you read in this book, Jen Robinson, who is one of Julian's lawyers and a human rights attorney, she describes how the work that Julian has done has saved her clients. And she's really thrilled because she gets to use the information that he puts out. If you read what Michael Ratner says at the end, he says, well, things have been going so badly that Julian is only the light, because he's had so many cases in which national security has been brought up as the reason why he can't go forward, that he looks at Julian as the possibility of going forward, and he doesn't see any possibility. So we have a lot of different views in this book, and it's a wonderful book, and I hope you all purchase it and share it and use it as a tool the way other people are. Thank you very much.
I'm a journalist with The Nation magazine, and I host a new show called Pushback with the Gray Zone. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be able to speak to you. When Robert Mueller gave his long-awaited closing testimony in July, it actually wasn't a very significant event. We didn't learn very much. We learned, I think, two main things. The first thing we learned is that Robert Mueller didn't know the basics of his own investigation. But that to me didn't really matter much, because as I think we all know now, the Russia investigation itself was pretty much a joke. And so it was fitting that its putative head didn't know much about it. The other significant thing from that hearing, I think, came when Robert Mueller was asked whether he agrees with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's assessment that WikiLeaks is a, quote, hostile intelligence service. And Robert Mueller, without flinching, said, absolutely. And I found that moment so striking, because here is the person who we were told for 2 years was going to be the answer to Donald J. Trump and end his presidency, and was presented to us as a liberal hero. Well, here he is co-signing and endorsing the reactionary viewpoint of the Trump administration when it comes to a media publisher, a publisher who was demonized because he exposed the secrets of the powerful, and therefore he had to be silenced. And the irony on top of that, Robert Mueller was supposed to be the answer to Trump and his hatred of media freedom and all of our liberties. Well, here was Robert Mueller in lockstep with Trump in an assault on media freedom. And it captured to me what I think has been a very worrying dynamic of the Trump era, where liberals and progressives have been enrolled under the guise and the pretense of opposing Trump and a very toxic reactionary mindset that is actually ultimately used to attack the left. And I think Julian Assange has been a martyr in that assault. When we think about people who are demonized here in the West, it's usually reserved for leaders, foreign movements that we want to overthrow with regime change or proxy wars. Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad. But rarely has the sort of apparatus of demonization been used against somebody in the West like it has against Julian Assange. And who is he? He's not even a political leader, he's a media publisher. And what does he do? He publishes accurate information. And yet, in the Trump era, what's been so concerning is that liberals have been enrolled in this assault on him. And we've seen that play out. The irony of Robert Mueller calling WikiLeaks a hostile intelligence service, when meanwhile, media outlets across the West have been enrolled as pretty much arms of US intelligence efforts to demonize dissent. And Assange is Exhibit A. I mean, look at the way he's been covered. Randy Credico, who was here, he was cast in a starring role as being in this wild conspiracy theory that he was a conduit between Roger Stone on behalf of the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks on behalf of Julian Assange, even though all the available evidence, as was apparent from the start, undermined that crazy theory. And media outlets took part in this. There was a piece this summer on CNN purporting to show, based on surveillance footage from the Spanish company that was hired to spy on Julian Assange, how Assange conspired with Russian hackers. It was this elaborate tale, and it was all based on essentially a fiction. And later on, when it came out that the same Spanish company had been used by the CIA to spy on Julian Assange, have cameras in the women's bathroom at the Ecuadorian embassy, the media attention to that was pretty much nil. It was reported in Spain. It got almost no coverage here, and it was deemed to be almost normal that we'd be surveilling a media publisher. When I think about Julian Assange, for me, this is not just about standing up for this brave person who has been subjected to this, unspeakable persecution. It's also not just about defending media freedom that we all know the case against him very much threatens, but it's also about standing up to a really toxic effort to enroll liberals and progressives in an assault on their own values. I can't express my appreciation enough to Julian Assange and his supporters for standing up to that and for shining a light on the powerful that want to silence him. So, thank you.
I'm Nathan Fuller, Director of the Courage Foundation, and want to thank Colin and OR Books for putting this together, and thank you all for being here. Royalties from this book are going to go to the Courage Foundation, and so I figured I should tell you what that's all about. In 2014, we started Courage, in its international organization in right now primarily US and the UK, as a hub for whistleblowers, a support network of all kinds for whistleblowers and other journalistic sources. And so we helped make Edward Snowden's documents searchable, the whole archive, text searchable. We've raised funds and awareness for Jeremy Hammond and Chelsea Manning and their legal teams, especially since the Moreno administration started tightening the screws on Assange in the embassy. We've been really focused on supporting Assange and WikiLeaks. And that means we raise funds for the legal defense team in the UK, and we write a daily live blog about political, legal developments, Assange's prison conditions, which, as you've heard, are horrendous. And in the US here, I help organize events, and to that end, we can announce that on February 12th at People's Forum in Midtown, we'll have a big Assange and press freedom event. So that's just 2 weeks before his extradition hearing in London. And James Goodale, who's the former New York Times general counsel who defended that paper's right to publish the Pentagon Papers, will be speaking there as well. So look out for that. We'll have more information and other speakers and everything going forward. So yeah, I just want to thank you all for coming here. Thanks for the book and event, and appreciate it. Take care.
Amy, make your way up.
Hi, everyone. It's really quite remarkable to be back here at 124 Washington. Thanks all for coming out. I think it was April of 2010 that video documents and thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, millions of documents were released by WikiLeaks. Among them was a video of what happened on July 17th, 2007. This was a moment that a group of Iraqis were walking in the area of New Baghdad, in Baghdad, Iraq. And they were walking to show two Reuters journalists, up-and-coming videographer, revered in the Reuters community, 22-year-old Namir Noor Eldin, and his driver, Saeed Shama, who was 40 years old and was the dad of 4 kids. Both of them were so well respected at Reuters. Years later, I would be at a Reuters studio in Washington, D.C., and I would see the book of the Reuters dead, the reporters who had died around the world, that was right at the elevator when people came in so they wouldn't forget. So Saeed, Namir, and the community of New Baghdad were walking because the men in the community wanted to show these two journalists what had happened the day before. A bombing had taken place and killed a number of people. And as they walked, Saeed and Namir holding cameras, a U.S. helicopter, Apache helicopter, flew overhead. The reason we have this is because of WikiLeaks. And it wasn't the video of an Iraqi resident on the ground or a peace activist. It was the Army video footage from the vantage point of the Apache helicopter. And it showed the men below. It showed the men holding the cameras as well. And you heard the voices, the laughter, the chatter, the cursing of the US soldiers. And as they observed what was happening below, they talked about opening fire on this group of Iraqis. They had a question about it though, and so they called back to the forward operating base and they said, can we open fire? So this wasn't a rogue group. They got permission and they opened fire, killing something like a dozen of the men, including, well, Namir Noor Eldin died almost immediately. Saeed Shama was injured. He was crawling away. You can see in the video as the men, the soldiers, are laughing and cursing. And then a van pulled up. A dad was taking his 2 kids to school, but he saw the carnage and he wanted to help the wounded. And so he was pulling up to stop. Again, the soldiers asked for permission to open fire on the vehicle that was pulling up. They got the permission, they opened fire, and in the process they finished off Saeed Shama. That was the 2 Reuters employees, the journalist and his driver. But to be a fixer in Iraq, you were essentially a reporter, Saeed, because you would have these foreign journalists coming in and they would show them the whole area and he would introduce them to people to interview. So Saeed and Namir were killed. Reuters immediately responded to the head of Reuters International, demanding to know what had taken place, demanding any record of what had taken place. And this went on for years. The US government said there was no record. In the end, that video was released thanks to Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks. I dare say these 2 Reuters staffers and the men in the community, the children, by the way, were critically wounded, might not have happened if we had also gotten the documents earlier of what happened 6 months before. That was in February of 2007. We also learned this from the leak of WikiLeaks documents. 2 Iraqis were walking. The same Apache helicopter unit is overhead. And when the men saw the Apache helicopter unit, they put up their hands as if to surrender. The soldiers again called back to base, said, can we open fire? They got permission, and they blew these 2 men away because you can't surrender to a helicopter. If people had learned about that first attack 6 months before, when it happened, if WikiLeaks had somehow gotten their hands on it, or any journalistic organization or anyone, a whistleblower, had gotten an image or had the documents of what had taken place, I think that people all over the United States would have called for an investigation. What do you mean? People are surrendering and you blow them away? And perhaps if we had had that information then, and if these men had been investigated at that point, the soldiers in the sky, then what happened 6 months later to this community in New Baghdad and to the Reuters beloved workers and journalists, perhaps that never would have happened because we had the information. This kind of information in a time of war is absolutely critical. It's a matter of life and death. And that's what Julian Assange has been engaged in for all of these years, even the time that he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. I got a chance to meet Julian. Well, apparently I met him first at the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen. I just didn't realize that at the time, outside the Bella Center. We called it the Bella of the Beast. But he told me about it a few years later because I went to visit him. Well, first I moderated a forum when he was wearing an ankle monitor, but he was still outside of the Ecuadorian embassy. I moderated a forum in an old boxing ring in London between him and Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher. I went back to interview him when she went into the Ecuadorian embassy, and I went there several times to talk to him. I don't remember everything he said or I said to him, but I realize now, especially this week, though I suspected it at the time, if ever I want an absolute transcript of everything we talked about, I guess I could just apply to the Spanish company that we now know was working for the United States, eavesdropping on everyone. And I'm not just talking about journalists. I'm talking about doctors. I'm talking about lawyers, anyone who was visiting Julian Assange. The fact that he's in Belmarsh prison right now, and Niels Melzer will be broadcasting what he said here in New York, the UN rapporteur, special rapporteur of the United Nations, who actually was skeptical of the whole case at the beginning. And then someone said, you really should look into it. And he realized, he visited Julian in Belmarsh and said, this is a man who is suffering from psychological torture. And it didn't just begin in Belmarsh. He's been in captivity for years. So when we were there in the embassy talking to him about issues of war and peace, I thought about all that Michael Ratner had done in representing him. And here we are in Michael and Karen and Jake's house. And I see that sign on the table that says Michael Ratner Presente. Michael Ratner was Julian Assange's lawyer. And as Margie said, how many hours he spent here talking to Julian, not to mention going to visit him in the embassy. So I thought I'd end with Michael's words. He writes the epilogue in this book. Michael Ratner, who died a few years ago, who was so dedicated to truth, to honesty, and to justice. Michael said, I've asked myself, why are truth tellers like Assange, Manning, Snowden, and Hammond so important to me? The answer is that they've succeeded in doing what CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I have been trying to do ever since the so-called war on terror began in the wake of the September 11th attacks. For more than a decade, we lawyers at CCR brought at least a dozen lawsuits seeking to expose and end rendition, illegal drone strikes, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the torture at Guantanamo and other U.S. secret prisons. We tried to hold accountable those responsible for war crimes, but each time the government would go into court and say, you can't litigate this national security. Every lawsuit was dismissed, even in the open and shut case of Maher Arar, the Canadian citizen who was taken off a plane at Kennedy Airport, sent to Syria, tortured. We couldn't get past the circuit court, Michael wrote. And he said, I think it would be easier if I had a little flashlight here, which is, I think, very much what Julian Assange represents: light and transparency and illuminating what we should all already know. Michael said, and the one time we did win at the Supreme Court with Russell, it was impossible to enforce the ruling. We'd reached a dead end. Then all of a sudden, people like Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Sarah Harrison, Aaron Schwartz, and Jeremy Hammond came out of nowhere. With acts of great courage, they revealed to the world what this country is actually doing. They sparked a much-needed public discussion of the U.S. government's secret, illegal, and inhumane policies, and they brought people into the streets. As a result, we're seeing the unraveling of governments and corporations all over the world. Michael concludes, "My experience has taught me that the truth has a way of coming out, even when the most powerful government on earth tries to crush it. Each time a whistleblower, a publisher, or a hacker has been jailed, tortured, or driven to suicide, other truth tellers have come forward, and there will be many more. It's truly a remarkable time we're living in. What we must remember is that we are in this together. It's up to all of us to protect the truth tellers. If we do, we'll have true democracy someday in this country and the world." Michael Ratner, presente, and Julian Assange, if there is justice in the world, well, as the great journalist Alan Nairn used to say, if we lived in a just world, who would be behind bars and who would be free?
I'm Barry Pollack. I'm a lawyer, and I have the great privilege of representing Julian Assange in the criminal charges that have been brought against him in the United States. I was honored when I was invited to this event and asked to speak last, and I thought this was great because, I could just plagiarize from what everybody else had already said. The bad news is everybody's already said anything, so there's not a lot left for me. I really want to thank Margie for this book and for everybody who contributed to it. It is so vitally important. James Goodall, who Nathan mentioned, is the former general counsel of the New York Times who fought the war over the Pentagon Papers, has said that the criminal case involving Julian Assange is not just the greatest First Amendment case of this century, it is the greatest First Amendment case of any century. So thanks, James, no pressure. It is the gravest threat to the First Amendment we have seen. Whether you are on the left or the right, I don't know how anybody can listen to what Amy just talked about and say that there was nothing newsworthy about the collateral murder video showing American military personnel gunning down Reuters staffers who were visibly carrying cameras when they were assassinated and injuring small children. The idea that there are people on the ground raising their hands and that military personnel are calling back and saying, "Are we allowed to shoot? What are the rules of engagement?" And the answer came back, "You can't surrender to a helicopter, smoke them." No one can argue that it was not in the public's interest to know what the American government was doing in the name of American citizens. This is not just about Julian Assange's right to publish. It is about our right to know what the government is doing in our name. And there is, in my mind, no more important cause than supporting Julian Assange, fighting his extradition to the United States, and if they are successful in bringing him here, defending him against these charges that are a threat literally to journalists all over the world. Julian Assange is an Australian citizen publishing in the UK, and that shows you the lengths that the United States government will go to suppress information about what the United States government has done. So please buy the book. Please go to the Courage Foundation's website, defendwikileaks.org. Make a contribution, and more importantly, sign up, give us your contact information so we can be in touch about events like the event in February, and encourage your friends, your colleagues to do the same. This, to me, is not a political issue. This is not about the 2016 election. This is about the leaks in 2010 and 2011 by Chelsea Manning. That is what Julian Assange is being prosecuted for. He's being prosecuted for publishing that video that Amy talked about. The Obama administration reviewed this matter and decided not to charge Julian Assange because it would be utterly inconsistent with First Amendment values to criminally prosecute a publisher for publishing truthful information. The Obama administration also commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning, the leaker, from 35 years to 7 years, essentially time served. There has been absolutely no new information that has come to light, but the current administration obviously has taken a position 180 degrees differently and has charged Assange with 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act and with the unauthorized access of the computer, which was Chelsea Manning accessing the computer that she had the right to access as military personnel and leaking that information to Assange. She is facing 180 years of prison in the United States for publishing truthful information. So I really want to thank everybody who's involved. I want to just say how privileged I was to know Michael Ratner and his efforts, not just on behalf of Assange, but so many causes. And I want to thank Margie and thank all of you for being here. It's really heartwarming to see this many people here. Now, let's all recruit 10 people we know and really grow this so that we have a strong and united voice in the United States that it is not okay to prosecute someone for publishing truthful information. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a drink, buy the book.
Yeah.